My name is Nick, and I'm 25 years old now. But this story starts when I was 17, standing in the doorway of what used to be my childhood home in suburban Denver, Colorado. The autumn wind was cutting through my thin jacket as I watched my parents load the last of their belongings into a U-Haul truck. "Mom, please," I remember saying, my voice barely above a whisper. The words felt foreign in my mouth, like I was speaking a language I'd forgotten how to use. She turned around, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the afternoon sunlight. Even in that moment, she looked more concerned about her appearance than about leaving her only daughter behind. "Nick, honey, you're almost 18. You're smart. You'll figure it out." She said it so casually, like she was telling me to figure out my homework instead of my entire future. My father didn't even look at me. He was too busy securing a tarp over their furniture, the same furniture I'd grown up around, the same couch where we used to watch movies together when I was little. Before everything changed, before his business started failing and they decided that their 17-year-old daughter was just another expense they couldn't afford. "We left some money on the kitchen counter," Mom added, clicking toward the truck in her high heels. "It should last you a few weeks if you're careful." A few weeks. As if that was supposed to solve everything. I stood there watching them drive away, the sound of the truck's engine fading into the distance, until all I could hear was the rustling of the oak trees lining our street. The house behind me felt enormous and empty, every creak and settling sound amplified in the silence they left behind. The money on the counter turned out to be $300 and a note that said, "We know you can do this. Love, Mom and Dad." The word love was written in my mother's careful cursive, but it felt hollow, like everything else they'd left me. That first night, I sat on my bedroom floor surrounded by everything I owned, trying to figure out what figuring it out actually meant. The house was paid for, but there were still utilities, property taxes, food, and somehow I needed to finish high school. At 17, most of my classmates were worried about prom dates and college applications. I was worried about keeping the lights on. I remember calling my Aunt Sarah in Phoenix that night, my hands shaking as I dialed her number. She was my mom's sister, and I thought maybe, just maybe, she didn't know what my parents had done. "Oh, sweetie," she said when I explained the situation, and I could hear the pity in her voice. "I wish I could help, but Jim just lost his job, and we're barely making it ourselves. Besides, your parents wouldn't have done this if they didn't think you could handle it." Even she was buying into their narrative that abandoning me was somehow an act of faith in my abilities. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls to relatives who all had excuses, and visits to school counselors who looked at me with sympathy, but offered little practical help. The guidance counselor, Mrs. Peterson, was kind, but overwhelmed. "There are some programs for emancipated minors," she told me, shuffling through pamphlets on her desk. "But the process takes time, and you'd need to prove you can support yourself." Support myself. At 17, with no job experience beyond babysitting the neighbor's kids for $20 a night, I started skipping lunch to save money, telling myself I wasn't hungry anyway. The house felt different without the constant hum of family life. My parents had taken the good TV, most of the kitchenware, and even my dad's old laptop that I sometimes used for school projects. They'd left me with the basics and a problem I was supposed to solve on my own. But here's the thing about being abandoned when you're 17. It either breaks you completely or it forges something harder than steel inside you. As I sat in that empty house, listening to my stomach growl and trying to figure out how to pay the electric bill, I felt something crystallizing in my chest. It wasn't hope exactly, and it wasn't anger, though there was plenty of that. It was determination. I was going to figure it out. All right. But not in the way they expected. The first job I got was at Murphy's Diner on Colfax Avenue, a 24-hour place that smelled like bacon grease and broken dreams. The manager, a heavyset man named Tony with kind eyes and calloused hands, hired me on the spot when I told him I could work any shift, any day. "You sure about that, kid?" he asked, looking at me over his reading glasses. "Night shift ain't easy, especially for someone your age." "I'm sure," I said, and I meant it. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford anyway. I worked the graveyard shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., serving coffee to insomniacs, cab drivers, and people who had nowhere else to go. The tips weren't great, but they were steady, and Tony let me eat one meal per shift for free. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept me fed and gave me enough money to cover the utilities. School became a challenge I had to navigate on 3 hours of sleep. I'd get home from the diner at 7:30, shower, and be in first period by 8:15. My teachers noticed I was falling asleep in class, but when they asked about it, I just said I had insomnia. It wasn't technically a lie. The hardest part wasn't the exhaustion, though. It was the isolation. My classmates were planning spring break trips and stressing about SATs while I was calculating whether I could afford both groceries and the heating bill. I stopped hanging out with friends because I couldn't afford to go to movies or grab food after school. Eventually, they stopped asking. But working at Murphy's taught me things they don't cover in high school economics classes. I learned how to read people, how to diffuse tension with a smile and a fresh cup of coffee, how to manage multiple tasks under pressure. Most importantly, I learned that there were all kinds of people struggling to make it, and most of them were doing it without anyone's help. There was Margaret, a night shift nurse who stopped in for coffee every morning after pulling double shifts at Presbyterian Hospital. She had 3 kids and was working toward her master's degree by taking online classes during her breaks. "You just keep putting one foot in front of the other," she told me one morning, leaving a $5 tip on a $2 coffee. "Eventually, you'll look back and realize how far you've walked." Then there was Carlos, who drove for a cab company and was saving every penny to bring his family up from Mexico. He taught me basic Spanish during slow nights and always ordered the same thing: black coffee and whatever pie we had left over from the dinner crowd. "Mi hija," he'd say, which I learned meant, "my daughter." Sometimes the hardest roads lead to the best destinations. These people became my inadvertent mentors, showing me that survival wasn't just about paying bills. It was about maintaining dignity and hope while doing whatever it took to build something better. As spring turned to summer, I developed a routine that worked. I'd sleep from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m., get up and do homework, grab something to eat, and head to the diner by 10:30. On weekends, I picked up extra shifts at a local grocery store, bagging groceries and cleaning floors. But the real turning point came in June, when I overheard 2 customers talking about a business opportunity. They were discussing a small tech startup that was looking for part-time help with data entry and customer service. It wasn't much, but it paid better than the diner and offered flexible hours. I wrote down the company name on a napkin: Dataflow Solutions. The next day, I called them from the payphone outside the grocery store. The woman who answered, Jennifer, sounded harried but interested when I explained that I was looking for part-time work and could offer evenings and weekends. "Can you come in for an interview Thursday at 4? She asked. "Absolutely," I said, already calculating how I could switch shifts with another waitress to make it work. Dataflow Solutions operated out of a converted warehouse in the River North Art District. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, but inside there was an energy that I'd never felt before. People were moving with purpose, phones were ringing, and there was a sense that something important was happening. Jennifer turned out to be the office manager, a woman in her 30s with short red hair and the kind of focused intensity that made you want to sit up straighter. She interviewed me in a glass-walled conference room that overlooked the main workspace. "You're 17, she said, looking at my application. "Still in high school. That's unusual for this type of work." "I'm motivated," I replied. "I need this job, and I'll work harder than anyone else you interview." She smiled at that. "What makes you think you can handle data entry and customer service?" I thought about all those nights at Murphy's, dealing with difficult customers while managing multiple orders and keeping track of tabs. I'm good with people, even when they're frustrated, and I'm detail-oriented. I have to be. She hired me for 15 hours a week at $12 an hour. It wasn't enough to quit the diner, but it was a start. Working at Dataflow was like getting a crash course in business. The company helped other businesses organize and analyze their customer data, and even though I was doing basic tasks, I was learning how companies operated from the inside out. I watched how decisions got made, how problems got solved, and how the people at the top thought about growth and strategy. The owner, a man named David Chen, was in his early 40s and had started the company after getting laid off from a larger tech firm. He was always working late, always pushing to find new clients and improve their services. Sometimes he'd stop by my desk to check on my work, and we'd end up talking about business strategy or market trends. "You ask good questions," he told me one evening as I was finishing up a customer database update. "Most people your age don't think about the bigger picture." "Most people my age don't have to," I replied without thinking. He looked at me curiously but didn't push for details. Instead, he started giving me small additional projects: researching potential clients, updating their website content, even sitting in on client calls to take notes. Each new responsibility came with a small raise and, more importantly, with knowledge I couldn't have gotten anywhere else. By the end of summer, I was making enough between Dataflow and the diner to not just survive, but to start saving money. I opened my first real bank account and watched my balance grow from $50 to $500 to over $1,000. It wasn't much, but it represented something I'd never had before: security and options. As my senior year started, I felt like I was living in 2 different worlds. At school, I was just another student trying to graduate. But in the evenings and weekends, I was learning how businesses really worked, how deals got made, and how success got built one decision at a time. I had figured it out, just like my parents said I would. But I was figuring out a lot more than they'd ever imagined. Senior year brought college applications, and while my classmates stressed about which universities would accept them, I was facing a different kind of decision. David had offered me a full-time position at Dataflow after graduation, with a salary that would let me quit the diner and maybe even rent a small apartment. "You've got real talent for this," he told me during one of our late evening conversations. "I started this company because I believed small businesses needed better tools to understand their customers. You seem to understand that instinctively." The offer was tempting, but something inside me wanted more. Maybe it was all those nights serving coffee to people who were working toward something bigger. Or maybe it was the stubborn streak I'd inherited from my father. Despite everything, I wanted to go to college, but I needed to find a way to make it work financially. That's when I discovered the University of Colorado's evening program for working adults. I could take classes at night and on weekends while keeping my job at Dataflow. It would take longer to get my degree, but it was possible. I applied for financial aid as an independent student, which required documenting that my parents weren't supporting me. It was the first time I'd had to officially acknowledge what had happened, filling out forms that asked for explanations of why I wasn't living with my family. The financial aid officer, a patient woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, helped me navigate the process. "It's unusual for someone your age," she said, "but not unheard of. You'll qualify for more aid as an independent student, and your work experience will actually help with some scholarship applications." I started classes that January, taking 2 courses per semester: Introduction to Business and College Algebra. After working full-time and taking care of myself for over a year, sitting in a classroom felt almost luxurious. I was older than most of the other students, but not by much, and I found that my work experience gave me a different perspective on what we were learning. In my business class, when the professor talked about customer relationship management, I could relate it to actual experiences I'd had at Dataflow. When we discussed cash flow and budgeting, I thought about those early months when I'd had to choose between groceries and heating bills. But the real breakthrough came in March, when David approached me with a problem. "We're losing clients," he said, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "Small businesses are saying our services are too expensive, but the larger companies want more sophisticated features than we can provide. We're stuck in the middle." I'd been thinking about this issue for weeks, watching client calls and analyzing the feedback we were getting. "What if we're approaching this wrong?" I asked. "What do you mean? Instead of trying to serve everyone, what if we focused specifically on businesses that are scaling up, companies that have outgrown basic tools but aren't ready for enterprise-level solutions?" David leaned back in his chair, considering this. "Go on." "I've been looking at our client data, and our most successful relationships are with companies that have between 50 and 200 employees. They're growing fast, they have real customer data challenges, but they still need personalized service. What if we built our entire business model around serving that specific market?" Over the next few weeks, David and I worked on refining this idea. I researched the competition, analyzed market trends, and even reached out to some of our former clients to understand why they'd left. What I found was a clear gap in the market. Growing companies needed sophisticated data analysis tools, but they also needed the kind of hands-on support that larger firms didn't provide. "This could work," David said after reviewing my research, "but it would mean completely restructuring how we operate. New software, new processes, new marketing approach. It's basically starting over." "Sometimes starting over is the only way to move forward," I replied, thinking about my own experience. By summer, we'd developed a comprehensive plan for repositioning Dataflow. Instead of being a general data services company, we'd become specialists in helping mid-sized businesses understand and leverage their customer information. We'd offer more sophisticated analytics than the basic tools these companies were currently using, but with the personal attention they needed to actually implement changes based on what they learned. The transition wasn't easy. We lost some clients who wanted to stick with the old model, and we had to invest in new technology and training. But by fall, we were starting to see results. Our new clients were staying longer, paying more, and referring other businesses to us. My role at the company had evolved too. I wasn't just doing data entry anymore. I was involved in client strategy sessions, product development discussions, and even sales calls. David had started introducing me as his business development associate, and I was making enough money to move out of my parents' old house and into a small apartment near campus. The apartment was tiny, just a studio with a kitchenette and a Murphy bed, but it was mine. I furnished it with pieces from thrift stores and garage sales, and every single item in that space was something I'd chosen and paid for myself. When I sat at my small dining table doing homework or cooking dinner on my 2-burner stove, I felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations. College was going well, too. I'd increased my course load to 3 classes per semester and was on track to graduate in 4 years instead of 5. My professors appreciated my real-world experience, and I found myself helping other students understand how the concepts we were learning applied to actual business situations. But the biggest change was internal. The desperate survival mode I'd been operating in since I was 17 was shifting into something else. Strategic thinking. I wasn't just trying to get through each day anymore. I was planning for a future that I was actively creating. One evening in November, as I was reviewing client reports at the office, David knocked on my cubicle wall. "Can we talk?" he asked. In his office, he sat down across from me with a serious expression. "Nick, I've been thinking about the future of this company, and I want to discuss something with you." My heart rate picked up. Was he going to let me go? Had I overstepped by getting so involved in strategic decisions? "I'm getting older," he continued, "and I've been doing this for 15 years. The repositioning strategy we implemented was your idea, and it's working better than anything I've tried before. I want to talk about making you a junior partner." I stared at him, not sure I'd heard correctly. "A partner? 20% ownership," he said, "with a path to increase that over time. You'd have real decision-making authority and a share of the profits, but you'd also be taking on more responsibility and risk." I thought about that 17-year-old girl standing in the doorway watching her parents drive away. She couldn't have imagined this moment, couldn't have pictured herself sitting in a business office discussing partnership agreements. But she'd started this journey, making one difficult decision after another, building something from nothing. "I accept," I said. David smiled and extended his hand. "Welcome to the big leagues, partner." As we shook hands, I realized that my parents had been right about one thing. I had figured it out. I'd just figured out a lot more than they'd ever expected me to. Becoming a partner at Dataflow changed everything, but not in the ways I expected. The 20% ownership came with equity papers I had to sign, business insurance I had to understand, and tax implications that required hiring an accountant. At 21, while my college classmates were worried about finding internships, I was learning about profit and loss statements, market analysis, and long-term business strategy. The increased income allowed me to move into a larger apartment and accelerate my college timeline. I was taking 4 classes per semester now and working toward a bachelor's degree in business administration, with a focus on information systems. The combination of practical experience and academic theory was powerful. I understood not just how to do things, but why certain approaches worked better than others. Our repositioning strategy was paying off in ways that exceeded even my optimistic projections. By focusing specifically on growing mid-sized companies, we developed expertise that our competitors couldn't match. We understood the unique challenges these businesses faced. They were too large for simple solutions, but too small for enterprise-level complexity. I was handling client relationships for accounts worth 6 figures annually, leading strategy sessions, and even presenting at industry conferences. When people asked about my background, I'd learned to position my story strategically. I started working in business development when I was 17 and have been combining work experience with formal education ever since. It was true, just not the whole truth. The real test came in the spring of my junior year, when we landed our biggest client yet, Morrison Manufacturing, a Denver-based company that made specialized industrial equipment. They had grown from 50 employees to over 300 in just 5 years, and were struggling to understand their customer data across multiple product lines and geographic markets. The contract was worth more than all our other clients combined, but it also required us to expand our capabilities significantly. We needed to hire additional staff, invest in more sophisticated software, and develop custom solutions we'd never attempted before. "This could make us," David said during one of our planning sessions, "or it could break us if we can't deliver." I spent weeks researching Morrison's industry, studying their competition, and developing a comprehensive analysis of their data challenges. The presentation I created was 60 slides of detailed market analysis, customer segmentation strategies, and implementation timelines. When we met with their executive team, I found myself leading most of the discussion. "Ms. Johnson," their CEO said afterward, "that was one of the most thorough proposals we've seen. How long have you been doing this type of work?" "Long enough to know what works," I replied with more confidence than I felt. They signed the contract. Managing the Morrison account required me to essentially run my own division within Dataflow. I hired 2 junior analysts, coordinated with their IT department, and worked directly with their regional managers to implement our recommendations. For 6 months, I was working 60-hour weeks while still taking classes and maintaining my other client relationships. The results were remarkable. Within 4 months of implementation, Morrison had identified new market opportunities worth millions of dollars, streamlined their customer service processes, and improved their retention rates by 15%. Their success became a case study that we used to attract other large clients. But success brought its own challenges. David was increasingly talking about expansion, opening offices in other cities, maybe even franchising our model. The conversations excited me, but also made me nervous. I'd learned to handle growth at our current scale, but what he was describing would require capital, systems, and expertise we didn't currently have. That's when my father called. I hadn't heard from my parents since they'd left 4 years earlier. Occasionally, I'd wonder what had happened to them, whether they'd ever made their finances work, whether they ever thought about the daughter they'd abandoned. But I'd learned to push those thoughts aside and focus on building my own life. Nick? His voice on the phone sounded older, uncertain. Dad. I kept my tone neutral, though my heart was racing. We heard about your success. Someone mentioned seeing your name in a business journal article about data flow. I waited, not making it easy for him. We're back in Denver, he continued. Things didn't work out in Arizona like we hoped. We were wondering if we could meet, maybe talk about opportunities. The word opportunities hit me like a physical blow. After 4 years of silence, he was calling because he'd heard I was successful. What kind of opportunities? I asked. Well, we know you're doing well in business, and we have some experience that might be valuable. Maybe we could work together, pool our resources. I almost laughed. Pool our resources. The man who'd left me with $300 and a note wanted to pool resources. I'll think about it, I said, and hung up. That night, I sat in my apartment trying to process the call. Part of me was furious that they'd only reached out because they thought I could help them, but another part of me was curious about what they wanted, what they thought they could offer after all this time. I decided to meet with them, but on my terms. I suggested a coffee shop near the data flow office during business hours, treating it like any other professional meeting. They looked older when I saw them, worn down in ways that went beyond just the passing years. My mother's perfect appearance had been replaced by something more desperate, and my father had the slightly defeated posture of someone who'd run out of options. You look wonderful, Mom said, reaching across the table as if to touch my hand. I kept my hands around my coffee cup. Thank you. What did you want to discuss? Dad cleared his throat. We know we made some difficult decisions when you were younger, but we always believed you'd succeed. And you have, beyond what any of us imagined. You abandoned me when I was 17, I said quietly. Let's be clear about what happened. They both flinched, but I continued. You left a minor child to figure out housing, food, utilities, and finishing high school on her own. That wasn't a difficult decision, that was abandonment. We were desperate, Mom said, tears starting to form in her eyes. We didn't have any other choice. There are always choices. You chose to save yourselves and leave me behind. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with them explaining their financial difficulties and eventual bankruptcy, their unsuccessful attempts to start over in Arizona, and their current situation back in Denver. They were living in a small apartment, both working retail jobs and struggling to make ends meet. Finally, Dad got to the point. We know you probably don't trust us, but we have business experience. We could help Dataflow expand, maybe handle some of the administrative work or client development. I studied their faces, seeing desperation masked as opportunity. What makes you think I'd want to work with you? We're family, Mom said simply. Family doesn't abandon each other, I replied. But business partners can be evaluated on their merits. If you want to work with Dataflow, you can apply for positions like anyone else. We're always looking for qualified candidates. The look that passed between them told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't come to make amends or rebuild a relationship. They'd come because they thought family obligation would give them access to my success. I finished my coffee and stood up. I have a meeting to get to. If you're serious about employment opportunities, you can submit resumes through our website like any other applicants. Walking back to the office, I felt something I hadn't expected: relief. For 4 years, I'd carried a combination of anger and hurt about what they'd done. But seeing them again, hearing them try to position their abandonment as tough love and their current approach as family loyalty, clarified something important. I had built my success despite them, not because of them. Their belief that I'd figure it out hadn't been confidence in my abilities. It had been abdication of their responsibilities. The difference mattered. That evening, I called David to discuss the Morrison account results and our expansion plans. We were ready to take Dataflow to the next level, and I knew exactly how to do it. But we were going to do it with people who understood the difference between opportunity and exploitation, between family and business, between support and abandonment. I had figured it out, all right. And what I'd figured out was how to build something real without compromising the values that had gotten me there. 2 years later, Dataflow had grown beyond even David's ambitious projections. We'd opened a second office in Colorado Springs, hired 23 employees, and were generating annual revenues approaching $2 million. My ownership stake had increased to 30%, and I was officially the vice president of business development. At 23, I was managing accounts worth millions and speaking at industry conferences across the region. College was behind me now, I'd graduated summa cum laude while working full-time, an achievement that still felt surreal when I thought about where I'd started. The diploma hung in my office next to industry awards and client appreciation letters, a reminder of what was possible when you refused to accept limitations others tried to impose on you. But success, I was learning, brought its own complications. The first sign of trouble came during a routine quarterly review. David seemed distracted, less engaged in our strategic planning sessions, and increasingly focused on what he called operational efficiency. When I pressed him for details, he mentioned bringing in a consultant to evaluate our business processes. "We're growing fast," he explained, "and I want to make sure we're scaling efficiently. This consultant specializes in helping companies our size optimize their operations." The consultant turned out to be Richard Brennan, a sharp-dressed man in his 50s who spoke in corporate buzzwords and had an MBA from Wharton. He spent 2 weeks at our offices, interviewing employees, reviewing our procedures, and analyzing our financial data. His questions seemed reasonable at first, but gradually I noticed they were becoming more focused on my role specifically. "Tell me about the decision-making process for major accounts," he asked during one of our sessions. "David and I collaborate on strategy, but I handle most of the day-to-day client relationships and implementation," I explained. "And this arrangement has been in place since I became a partner 2 years ago." He made notes without comment, but something in his expression made me uncomfortable. The final presentation was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. David had asked me to attend, along with our office manager Jennifer and our senior analyst Mark. Richard's recommendations were presented in a slick PowerPoint with charts and graphs that looked impressive, but felt oddly disconnected from the actual work we did. "The primary finding," Richard announced, "is that data flow is over-dependent on individual relationships rather than systematic processes. This creates significant risk if key personnel were to become unavailable." He clicked to the next slide, which showed an organizational chart. My name was notably absent from the senior leadership positions. "My recommendation is to restructure the leadership team with more traditional corporate governance. A chief executive officer, chief operating officer, and department heads with clearly defined responsibilities and reporting structures." I looked at David, expecting him to push back on this generic corporate restructuring, but he was nodding thoughtfully. "The consultant's right," David said after Richard finished. "We've been operating too informally for a company our size. We need more professional management structures." "What does that mean for existing partnerships?" I asked directly. Richard and David exchanged a look that made my stomach drop. "Well," David said slowly, "partnerships work well in smaller organizations, but as we scale up, we need to transition to a more standard corporate structure. Employee ownership through stock options, performance-based compensation, that sort of thing." I felt the room spinning slightly. "Are you saying you want to dissolve our partnership agreement?" "I'm saying we need to evolve our business model," David replied, not quite meeting my eyes. The meeting ended with vague commitments to discuss the recommendations further, but I knew what I'd just witnessed. After 6 years of building this company together, after developing the strategy that had driven our growth, after bringing in the clients and managing the relationships that generated our revenue, I was being pushed out. That weekend, I sat in my apartment reviewing every document related to my partnership agreement. The lawyers had been thorough when we'd drawn up the original papers, but there were clauses about business restructuring that could potentially be used to dilute my ownership if positioned as necessary for company growth. Monday morning, I requested a private meeting with David. "I need to understand what's really happening here," I said, sitting across from him in his office. David sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Nick, you're incredibly talented, but this business has outgrown informal partnerships. Richard showed me companies similar to ours, and they all have traditional corporate structures. Investors expect it, clients expect it, and frankly, it's more professional." "Investors? What investors?" "I've been talking to some people about taking on capital to accelerate our expansion plans, but they won't invest in a company with unconventional ownership structures." There it was. David wanted to raise money, and my partnership was apparently inconvenient for potential investors. "So, after 6 years of building this company together, you're willing to push me aside for investors you haven't even secured yet?" "Nobody's pushing you aside. You'd have a senior position, equity participation, excellent compensation, as an employee, not a partner." "Nick, be realistic. You're 23 years old. Most people your age are just getting their first real jobs. I'm offering you a path to serious wealth and career advancement." The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. Despite everything I'd contributed, despite the success we'd built together, he still saw me as a kid who should be grateful for whatever opportunities he chose to offer. "I need some time to think about this," I said. "Of course. But Richard is presenting his final recommendations to the board next week. What board? We don't have a board. We will. Another part of professionalizing our operations. Walking back to my office, I felt a familiar sensation, the ground shifting beneath my feet, the realization that people I'd trusted were making decisions about my future without my input. It was like being 17 again, except this time I wasn't powerless. That evening, I called my lawyer, Patricia Martinez, who had helped me navigate the original partnership agreement. After I explained the situation, she was quiet for a long moment. They can restructure the company, she finally said, but they can't simply dissolve your partnership without cause or compensation. The question is whether they're planning to buy you out fairly or pressure you into accepting less than your ownership is worth. What would you recommend? Get your own valuation of the company. If they're serious about bringing in investors, there should be clear metrics for what data flow is worth. Make sure you understand the true value of what you'd be giving up. I spent the next week working with a business valuation specialist, reviewing our financial records, client contracts, and growth projections. The number we arrived at was staggering. Based on our revenue, client retention rates, and market position, Dataflow was worth approximately $12 million. My 30% ownership stake represented nearly $4 million in value. When I presented this information to David, his response confirmed my worst suspicions. "Those numbers are inflated," he said dismissively. "No one's going to pay $12 million for a regional data services company. Then why do you need investors to grow? Because we need capital for expansion, not because the company is worth what some consultant calculated on paper." It was becoming clear that David and his advisors were planning to significantly undervalue my ownership stake to make the restructuring financially attractive for them. They were counting on my youth and relative inexperience to accept whatever they offered, rather than fight for fair compensation. But they'd miscalculated. The 17-year-old girl who'd been abandoned with nothing had learned a lot about survival and strategy over the past 6 years. And one of the most important things she'd learned was when to fight and when to walk away. It was time to fight. That night, I began planning my next move. If they wanted to push me out of the company I'd helped build, they were going to discover that I hadn't spent 6 years learning their business just to walk away quietly. I'd figured out how to survive when I had nothing. Now I was going to figure out how to win when I had everything to lose. The next morning, I walked into Dataflow with a plan that had kept me awake all night but also filled me with the kind of clarity I hadn't felt since I was 17, and deciding I was going to survive no matter what it took. First, I needed allies. Over 6 years, I'd built relationships with every major client, and more importantly, I understood their businesses in ways that David and any potential investors didn't. I started with Morrison Manufacturing. "Sarah," I said to their VP of Operations during what appeared to be a routine check-in call, "I wanted to give you a heads up about some potential changes at Dataflow that might affect our service delivery." "What kind of changes?" she asked, and I could hear the concern in her voice. Morrison had just renewed their contract for another 2 years based on the results we'd delivered. There's talk of restructuring our client services model, bringing in outside management, potentially changing how accounts are handled. I kept my tone professional, but let the implications speak for themselves. "Nick, you've been our primary contact since day one. The relationship works because you understand our business. If that changes..." "I understand completely. I wanted you to hear it from me first." I had similar conversations with our 5 largest clients over the next 2 days. Without saying anything that could be construed as undermining the company, I made it clear that the personal relationships and deep industry knowledge that had driven their success with Dataflow were potentially at risk. The response was immediate and unanimous. They wanted assurances that their service levels wouldn't change, and specifically, that I would continue managing their accounts. Next, I needed to understand exactly what David and Richard were planning. I scheduled a meeting with Jennifer, our office manager, who had been with the company almost as long as I had. "Jen, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. What has David told you about the restructuring plans?" She looked uncomfortable. "Nick, I probably shouldn't..." "Jennifer, we've worked together for 5 years. If this restructuring goes through the way I think it will, both of our positions are going to change significantly. I need to know what we're dealing with." After a moment, she nodded. "Richard has been asking questions about your client relationship specifically. How much of the business comes from accounts you personally manage, whether clients have contracts with Dataflow or with you individually, that sort of thing?" "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That you handle about 70% of our revenue, and most of those clients specifically requested to work with you. But Nick, he also asked about non-compete clauses in employee contracts." That confirmed it. They weren't just planning to restructure my partnership, they were planning to lock me into a position where I couldn't leave and take clients with me, even if they treated me unfairly. That afternoon, I called Patricia Martinez again. "They're moving faster than I expected," I told her. I need to understand my options if this becomes adversarial. What are you thinking? I'm thinking about starting my own company. There was a long pause. Nick, that's a significant decision. You'd be walking away from your ownership stake in Dataflow, and there could be legal challenges if they claim you're violating fiduciary duties or stealing clients. What if the clients came to me? That's different, but you'd need to be very careful about how you handle it, and you'd need capital to start competing with an established company. I might have a solution for that too. The next morning, David called an all-hands meeting to announce the restructuring plans. Richard presented his recommendations to the entire staff, complete with new organizational charts and job descriptions. My new title would be Senior Account Manager, reporting to a Director of Client Services, who would report to David as CEO. When he finished, David opened the floor for questions. What happens to existing partnership agreements? I asked directly. Partnership structures will be transitioned to equity compensation packages over the next 6 months. Richard replied smoothly. Everyone will benefit from the more professional management structure. After the meeting, several employees approached me privately. Mark, our senior analyst, was particularly direct. This is garbage, Nick. Everyone knows you're the reason half these clients signed with us in the first place. I appreciate that, Mark, but companies evolve. We'll see how it works out. But privately, I was already moving to the next phase of my plan. That weekend, I drove to Morrison Manufacturing for a meeting I'd requested with their CEO, James Morrison himself. We met in his office on Saturday morning when the building was quiet and we could speak freely. Nick, Sarah tells me there might be changes at Dataflow that could affect our service relationship. There might be, yes. I wanted to discuss that with you directly. I laid out the situation honestly, the restructuring plans, the potential changes to client service models, and my concerns about maintaining the personalized approach that had driven their success. What are you proposing? He asked. I'm considering starting my own company, focused specifically on the kind of mid-sized, growing businesses that need sophisticated data analysis, but also need hands-on strategic support. Companies like Morrison. He leaned back in his chair, considering this. That would be a significant undertaking. Do you have the capital and infrastructure to handle accounts our size? I have some ideas about that, but first I need to know, if I could guarantee the same level of service you're getting now, with the same team handling your account, would Morrison consider working with a new company? Nick, you've saved us millions of dollars and helped us identify opportunities we never would have found otherwise. If you can provide the same quality of service, I don't care what name is on the contract. Over the next week, I had similar conversations with our 4 other major clients. The response was consistent. They cared about results and relationships, not company names. But I still needed capital and infrastructure to actually compete with Dataflow. That's when I made a call I'd been considering for months. Hello, Richard. This is Nick Johnson from Dataflow. I wanted to discuss a business opportunity with you. Richard Brennan, the consultant who'd recommended pushing me out, agreed to meet for coffee the next day. I arrived with a comprehensive business plan I'd spent the previous night preparing. I've been thinking about your recommendations for Dataflow, I began, and I think you're right that the company needs more professional management. But I also think there's an opportunity in the market that you may not have fully considered. I presented my analysis of the competitive landscape, showing how Dataflow's success had created a clear market niche, growing companies that needed sophisticated data services, but also needed strategic guidance to implement changes based on their analysis. The problem with restructuring Dataflow to serve this market, I continued, is that the existing corporate culture and client relationships are built around personal service. That's hard to systematize without losing what makes it valuable. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that instead of trying to force Dataflow into a traditional corporate model, we create a new company designed from the ground up to serve this specific market, with proper corporate governance, professional management structures, and scalable systems. I showed him financial projections, market analysis, and a detailed business plan. The company I was proposing would generate higher margins than Dataflow while serving a more targeted client base. And you think you could execute this plan? I know I can. I've already spoken with potential clients who would be interested in this kind of specialized service. Richard studied the documents for several minutes. This is impressive work, but starting a new company would require significant capital investment. I have some ideas about that too. What if we structured it as a joint venture? You provide the initial capital and business development expertise. I provide the industry knowledge and client relationships. 60-40 split, with me maintaining operational control. He looked surprised. You're proposing that I invest in a company that would compete directly with Dataflow? I'm proposing that we create a better solution for a market that Dataflow isn't positioned to serve effectively. The clients I'd bring to this new company are looking for more specialized service than Dataflow can provide under a traditional corporate structure. It was a calculated risk. Richard was primarily motivated by profit, and the business plan I'd presented showed significantly higher potential returns than the Dataflow restructuring. More importantly, he'd spent 2 weeks analyzing Dataflow's operations and knew that most of the valuable client relationships were connected to me personally. "I'll need to think about this," he said finally. "Of course. But I should mention that I've already received preliminary interest from several potential clients, including Morrison Manufacturing. If we're going to move forward, timing will be important." That evening, David called me at home. "Nick, I heard you had a meeting with Richard today. What was that about?" "Just discussing some of his recommendations for Dataflow's future. Richard seems to think you might be considering starting your own company." "I'm considering my options, yes. The restructuring you're proposing significantly changes my role and compensation. I need to evaluate what's best for my career." There was a long silence. "Nick, you know I value your contributions to Dataflow. If there are aspects of the restructuring that concern you, we can discuss modifications." "I appreciate that, David. But I think we both know that the direction you want to take Dataflow isn't compatible with the kind of partnership we've had. That's not necessarily bad, but it does mean I need to consider alternatives." 2 days later, Richard called to schedule another meeting. This time, he brought a lawyer and a preliminary partnership agreement. The terms were better than I'd hoped. He would provide $500,000 in startup capital. I would contribute my industry expertise and client relationships, and we'd split ownership 60-40 with me retaining operational control. "There's one condition," he said. "I want to see signed letters of intent from at least 3 major clients before we finalize the agreement." "That won't be a problem." The following Monday, I walked into David's office and placed my resignation letter on his desk. "Effective in 2 weeks, I'll be leaving Dataflow to start my own company. I wanted to give you as much notice as possible to ensure a smooth transition." David read the letter twice before looking up at me. "Nick, this is a mistake. You're walking away from a guaranteed successful career to chase something uncertain. I'm walking away from being an employee in a company I helped build to become an owner of something I'm building myself. What about your partnership stake? You're giving up millions of dollars. I'm trading a minority position in someone else's vision for a majority position in my own." Over the next 2 weeks, the exodus began. Morrison Manufacturing was the first to announce they wouldn't be renewing their contract with Dataflow, citing concerns about service continuity under the new management structure. 3 other major clients followed within days. Mark, our senior analyst, and 2 of our junior staff members gave their notice to join the new company. Jennifer decided to stay with Dataflow, but she helped ensure that the transition was as professional as possible. On my last day, David made one final offer. "I'll restructure the partnership deal. 40% ownership, guaranteed operational control of client services, and a seat on the board of directors." I considered it for a moment, thinking about the 17-year-old girl who would have been thrilled to have any security at all. But I wasn't that girl anymore. "David, 6 months ago, that would have been exactly what I wanted. But you've shown me that partnerships only work when both people are committed to them. You were ready to push me aside the moment it became convenient. I can't build a future on that foundation." 3 months later, Johnson Analytics opened its doors in a renovated warehouse space in Reno, Denver's River North Art District. We had 6 employees, 12 clients, and revenue projections that exceeded Dataflow's current numbers. The company I built was everything Dataflow could have been: sophisticated analytical services combined with strategic consulting, delivered by people who understood that business success wasn't just about data, but about the relationships and insights that turned information into competitive advantage. Richard turned out to be an excellent partner, providing the business development and operational expertise that complemented my industry knowledge. More importantly, he understood that our success depended on maintaining the personal relationships and customized service that larger firms couldn't provide. 6 months after leaving Dataflow, I learned that David had been unable to secure the investment funding he'd been pursuing. The company was struggling to retain clients without the relationships that had driven their growth, and several employees had left for better opportunities. I felt bad for the people still working there, but I didn't regret my decision. Sometimes the best way to preserve what you've built is to start over with people who share your vision. Today, Johnson Analytics has grown to 35 employees and generates over $5 million in annual revenue. We've opened offices in 3 cities and are consistently ranked as one of the top mid-market consulting firms in the region. But the real measure of success isn't the money or the recognition. It's the fact that I built something sustainable on my own terms, with people who understand the difference between partnership and exploitation. My parents never did apply for jobs at Dataflow, and I haven't heard from them since that awkward coffee meeting. Sometimes I wonder if they've heard about Johnson Analytics, if they know their abandoned daughter figured out more than just survival. I figured out how to build something that couldn't be taken away, how to create value that was mine regardless of what other people decided was convenient for them. Most importantly, I figured out that the best response to being underestimated isn't anger or resentment. It's success so clear and undeniable that it speaks for itself. When I sit in my office now, looking out at a team of talented people building something meaningful together, I sometimes think about that 17-year-old girl standing in the doorway watching her parents drive away. She couldn't have imagined this moment, but she started the journey that led here. They left me at 17 with, "You'll figure it out." They were right about that part. I just figured out a lot more than they ever expected, and I did it without them. The company they never thought I could build is now worth more than $20 million. And the best part? It's mine.